Just when you thought it was safe to watch videos again on the internet comes Tales from Someplace Besides the Garage.
Hey guys, I'm back. It's been a while. I'm out of practice with this. Thought I'm certainly due to do a video. Not that I intend necessarily on taking a winter break, but I'm giving you people a break from having to deal with me. And I don't really have all that much to talk about, and yet I could go on for hours, as you know. Can't say much has changed or much is new with me. Been listening to a lot of music, naturally, as always. Still looking for a job. But I guess the good news is that I did just finish recording my next album, and it's all done, it's all mixed, it's copied for the most part. It's out there, it's not up for sale yet. I've got the hard copies going to CD Baby, and they do the distribution from there, so they don't have the copies yet. And from there, CD Baby distributes it to all the places where you could buy it from, like Amazon and all those places. And they handle the downloads too. So they're the guys that send it to the iTunes and to the Amazon and all that stuff. So that's probably going to take another couple weeks. So I was doing, a lot of work for that. I showed this before, actually. I had the cover done. This is the only time I've had the cover done before I've had the album done. But it was a picture I had taken, a photo that I had taken that was in my computer that I forgot about. And I don't know where it was taken, and I would like to know. I know I was in my car, and I think I was actually driving while I took it, and kind of stuck the camera out the passenger side window. I have no idea where I took the photo. I know I took it, and I like it. So that's done. I started recording that in November, and there's a long. Most of my albums actually end on a long piece. There's a long 24+ minute piece on there, which is the last thing on the album, and it's the first thing I recorded in November. And then I recorded another long composition that's broken into 7 different sections. So it's essentially kind of like 2 long tracks, but there's 8 tracks on the album. And I don't know, it doesn't make any sense. But the first long track, which is about like 26, 27 minutes, is broken into 7 different sections. Quite different sections for the most part. So I broke those up according to the sections. And I recorded it, this one went pretty quick, I guess. I started November, and I finished it in, I don't know, mid-March, I guess. Not that long ago I finished it. And I'm really happy with the way it came out. My previous one that I did, which I called Landscapes, I actually recorded that in a week. That was a record-breaking thing. That was more of an experiment, and I liked the way it came out, so I released it as was. But that one had been done in a week, but I won't do that again, I don't think. Though I recorded that one in a week, it took me another month to mix it. So weird that composing and recording it would take less time than mixing it. This one I was mixing for quite a long time as well. Mixing's a funny thing. So I got that coming out, and besides that, there's a lot of electronic stuff on there on my new album. Several of the shorter sections in the first piece are entirely acoustic guitars, though. So I've got a bit of a balance there of acoustic and electric instruments. Oh, and it did the entire thing on guitars. I didn't do any keyboards on there. I'm talking about this, of course. No keyboards. No percussion. I definitely got to get percussion on my next one because my previous album didn't have any percussion on there either. At least hand percussion, if not like, drums. So I keep thinking that, next thing I do is going to have percussion on. I started doing this thing, and after I recorded a couple things that were all guitars, I'm like, gee, maybe I can make the whole album just guitars. So it's entirely guitars. Really two guitars, an electric guitar and an acoustic guitar, and my guitar synthesizer. So there's a lot of things on there that sound like keyboards that come from the guitar synthesizer. The guitar synthesizer has a lot of sounds and a lot of patches in there, and a lot of them sound like a keyboard, like a synthesizer. But it's all guitars. And it's weird. My favorite guitars is actually my nylon string classical guitar, and I didn't get any of that on the album, which will be something for next time, I guess. It's kind of nice to finish an album and have some ideas remaining left over, because I always think at some point the well is gonna run dry, idea-wise. But I've been lucky. It doesn't seem to be happening. The larger problem for me is the energy level to get up and do something and record something. A day doesn't go by that I don't think about, writing, recording the next piece, or finishing a piece that's kind of been started. I do have a bunch of pieces that were started in some cases years ago that were never finished. And yeah, I always have ideas, not so much for chord sequences, but for arrangements. It seems like the idea for the arrangements comes into my head first. And but then there's the energy level of picking up the guitar and I don't know, and setting up, and the guitar synthesizer is a very inspiring tool. But the problem is when you've got hundreds of sound samples to play around with, you can waste an entire day, 8-9 hours, going through these samples before you find something that clicks with you. And by then it's like, I'm tired of this, and you don't even want to go on and record anything. And then every once in a while, you'll select a sound sample and something inspires you almost immediately, and you start playing, and that's when things work, when they click. So, naturally I'm also listening, as I do all the time. And I got to grab some stuff. I have this thing. I don't know how to explain it. With some compilation series, I want to collect the whole series. One of them was the ECM Work series, which was the first time that ECM put out compilations of their artists. They had too many to actually collect. I came close to getting all of them, actually. And then they did the Rarum series on ECM, which I didn't come close to. I just scratched the surface of those. I liked the Work series that ECM put out, even though they were shorter. The CDs the compilations didn't run more than 50 minutes, so they didn't use the full capacity of the CD. And yet on a lot of those, I seem to like the material better than when they did the later series of compilations. So I like the Work series, and I've been buying those even after they went out of print. And then there was, and I think this is pure nostalgia, there was another series called Compact Jazz, which was put out by, Jesus, I don't know, where are they? What label is it? I got a whole stack of them here, but I can't believe that they don't print the label. Was it Verve? I think it was Verve. One of the mainstream jazz labels. And that had a lot of artists record for them over the years. And the Compact Jazz series, which has been out of print for many years, was a series that came around when compact discs were new. And they couldn't go back and immediately release on CD all of the old albums in somebody's history. Artists like Toots Thielman and even Miles Davis had one. And Buddy Rich and all that. These people had tons and tons of albums. And when the compact disc generation started, Cal Tjader's another one. They couldn't just immediately release all of their back catalog on CD, and in fact still haven't for most of these artists. So they put together these compilations called Compact Jazz, and it was almost like a career sampling of an artist's music, like Cal Tjader, who recorded a ton of records. And I like those. Those went out of print fairly early, like in the early 90s, as other compilations were put out on the same label. Verve Records is notorious for just releasing compilation after compilation. But there was something about those original Compact Jazz compilations that I liked. Plus, the artists that were represented on those compilations were also getting a lot more of their back catalog as time went on, released on CD. So it wasn't so much that you had to settle for just a sampling of their work on compact disc. But another series that, the funny thing is I thought I had several of them going back to the day. And it turns out I only had one of them. Was a series called Omni. This is electronic new age music for the most part. And these were compilations. And this is the first and only one that I had. I thought I had several. Volume 7. And what this was connected to the Omni magazine, which is no longer existing. Sad. It's just another thing. I think of all these labels that I loved that put out jazz and new age music. And the labels went out of business a long time ago. And there's so many great albums on those labels that are history now, that you have to scrounge around looking for used copies of. And I guess the same is in the magazine world, especially once, the digital world came along. Nowadays, there was a time going back to the 1950s, but, there was a time, 50s, 60s, 70s, when you could put out a magazine, and between, with the advertising and everything, and subscriptions, and newsstands carrying them, whatever, have a decent shot at having a fairly successful magazine. Nowadays, magazines are the physical, the paper magazines, the kind that, you would subscribe to. I used to love magazine subscriptions. Any magazine that I read with any regularity, at some point I would automatically just subscribe to. Because it's great. You go out to the mailbox, and every couple of weeks you got another issue of a magazine or something. Which used to excite me almost as much as getting a new album. And so there was this science. It was like a science magazine for the layperson. But it wasn't just science. It was science, but they also had like science fiction, so they had fiction stories and all that. So there was this magazine called Omni that was very successful in I guess it was the late 80s. And they were successful into the 90s and kind of petered off all of a sudden at the end of the 90s, and they're now history. And so they were apparently so popular at one point that they sanctioned a series which turned out to be 7 CDs, which all came out in 1994 and 95, of basically new age music. Now, these weren't original things. These were all compilations from existing albums. So they didn't actually go to artists and ask them to write a track for any of their albums. Everything that they put out on all 7 volumes was actually taken from existing albums by the artists. Mars Lacer, who got a lot of, I think it was on every one of these. Kevin Brahaney, Susan Ciani, Constance Demby, fairly well-known people if you know the music. And that was the only one I had, and I thought I had more than that one. And I pulled it out recently, and it's like I just got this bug in me, a stupid bug that, wow, I would really like that whole series. These are all out of print now. The magazine itself that was responsible for putting the compilations together is no longer existing. And actually, almost all of the albums that this series drew from came from smaller independent labels, and those labels are out of print. So the original albums that they took these tracks from are almost all out of print. Not entirely. Some of them have been re-released since, but I think all of the original labels were out of print. All of the original labels, I mean, that they drew these tracks from the original albums, all went out of print. Some of them, like Susan Ciani, the Cusco, which are fairly popular, and the Patrick O'Hearn, ended up getting, and Tangerine Dream even, ended up getting re-released. So the rights were purchased by other labels down the line or reverted back to the artist in some cases. But the original labels that all these songs were drawn from, all these tracks were drawn from, are all history now. Very, very sad, actually. Jan Hammer track there, Morris Lasser again, or Lasser, Metropolis Volume 1, pretty good one. These were short. I remember seeing these in the store. The entire series of 7 came out in 1994, 1995. All electronic. This is pretty much the electronic side. This isn't like the Windham Hill solo piano, solo acoustic guitar side. This is the more electronic side. These are good albums, though. I'm generally not a big fan of multi-artist compilations, but I play all 7 of these side by side, just in a row. Tim's Story, some good track. Actually, there's still, even now, I just picked these up. There's a few artists on here that didn't do a whole lot of albums, and I was not familiar with them. Iman, this one guy, Iman, was one of them, and there's some really great tracks. Himakami is another guy that I wasn't familiar with. Who else? Giles Reeves had one big album, Sea of Glass, I think it's called, Sea of Glass, yeah. That I used to see in the shops all the time, and I should have picked it up, and I didn't. Paul Averaginos, I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce it, but he does this really good track on here. Tim Clark, another guy, I should have picked up the album Tales of the Sun People when it was out there. Kind of got me nostalgic. The funny thing is I had kind of forgotten when these came out, and I actually thought that the compilations were from the late 80s. But looking their history up, I realized that they all came out in 94, 95. So they're more recent than I thought they were. And literally all the music really was fairly new at the time from these albums. This is one of my favorite covers, as a matter of fact. Most of the music was from around 1992. Go back to late 80s maybe, but it was fairly current, like 80. Most of the music is from about 87 to about 92, and the compilations came out in 94, 95. Some of these compilations, though, there's a lot of copies still around, and if you have any appreciation for quote-unquote new age, the electronic music, and you can get them reasonably, I would suggest picking them up. They're really good samplers to introduce you to new artists, people you didn't know, or people that you may have heard of but you weren't sure if you'd be into. David Arkenstone does a bunch of tracks on here. There's one track on here by two guys, Ted Greenwald and Scott Hiltzik, which is a duo which recorded one album about 1990, I want to say it was. 89 or 90. That I saw out in the store. I remember seeing this in the store when it came out. Hiltzik and Greenwald, just a duo. There's one track that has some slight percussion on there. I have to turn the light up because I can't read from 1988 this came out. And Sonic Atmospheres. And I got into listening to this again because I heard one track on there. So it's funny. So in some cases, listening to these Omni compilations kind of sent me back to some of the original albums. I would say I have, maybe 20% of the albums, maybe not even that this stuff is drawn from. I do have a handful of the original albums, the full artists' albums that they drew these compilations from. And the one track from Hiltzik and Greenwald sent me back to this album, which I used to see in the shops. Like Sonic Atmospheres for a few years was one of those small, independent, new age labels that had distribution in physical record stores back in the late 80s, maybe early 90s. And they had so many albums out at the time that I didn't pick up at the time. But just a few years ago, I went and picked this one up after hearing a track. Actually, the same track that ended up on this album was also on another sampler called the Windham Hill electronic music sampler, which I think I actually showed in one of my last videos. And when I pulled out that old Windham Hill electronic music sampler CD and listened to it again a few years ago, I had bought it when it originally came out in the late 80s. It sat on the shelf for years, pulled it out a number of years later, and dug this one track on there so much by Hiltzik and Greenwald that I went online and found a still sealed copy of it, even though it had been long out of print by that point. And I want to say this is maybe, 7 or 8 years ago. And this is a really good album. And there's probably still copies out there, even though it goes back to 88 and the label is no longer in existence. Good album. Nice album, though. Very mellow. They're 2 keyboard players. Like I said, the only guest is a percussionist on one track, playing some light percussion. And just a very nice, kind of quiet album. And so I've been listening to a lot of electronics, and my music has a lot of electronics in there as well. And so it set me out to, after a while, I got a little bit of electronic overload. And I also went on a bit of a listening binge for about a week or so of listening to Azimuth, who I've talked about before. Very hard for me to listen to their music now because I got into Azimuth in about 1978 or 79. Pianist John Taylor, vocalist Norma Winstone, and trumpeter Kenny Wheeler. Loved them for years, have all of their albums. Bought the albums as they came out, pretty much, as they were released, starting in the late 70s and going into the 80s. But both John Taylor and Kenny Wheeler have since passed away. And because the music itself is like the album cover, it's very kind of reflective and sometimes a bit sad, maybe even. Certainly reflective. That it makes it difficult to listen to. It's not like up-tempo rock and roll where you could, I could put on like a Jimi Hendrix album and not feel anything because Jimi Hendrix is dead now kind of thing, because of the nature of the music. But when you hear this sometimes mournful even music, kind of sad, low-key, reflective music, and you realize, hey, I got into these artists when these guys were still alive and they've passed away, and it's, it's a bit sad, but I just went on to this listening binge for several days to a week of pretty much listening to all of their albums back to back, which is about 5 albums, plus they did another couple albums with a big band, which they didn't call Azimuth, but it was the 3 Azimuth musicians with big bands. That's a little bit different in nature because it's a big band and there's drums and horns, so it's a little bit more up-tempo and wild, whereas all of their music is pretty much a bit, obviously, well, there's no percussion, just piano, voice, and trumpet. So there's no bass, there's no percussion. So it tends to be the kind of thing that you want to listen to. When you want to concentrate on music, you put it on. You're not going to be tapping your foot to a drum beat because there is no drum beat. But it's great stuff. So, and a lot more in the acoustic realm. There's synthesizers on one of the albums. There's a little bit of electronic organ on a couple of the other albums. But it's mostly an acoustic setup band. with a heavy acoustic presence. It's mostly acoustic piano and trumpet and voice. So I got into an acoustic listening mode. And I listened to a whole crap load. I got a whole bunch of Miles Davis vinyl here, but I don't want to go on. I'm really going on a lot longer. I went on a bit of a binge of listening to some old jazz compilations from the early 1950s that were all acoustic groups. And the one thing I like about acoustic music, and I'll probably do another video on this, is especially the way it was recorded in the 1950s. If you had a decent studio like Rudy Van Gelder's studio, and you listen closely, I swear you can actually hear the sound of the instruments bouncing off of the studio walls. If it's well recorded, you can hear the drums, you can even hear the bass and the piano. You can actually hear almost like the shape and the sound of the room. You know, the acoustic sounds of the instruments are going out into the air, but just like a nightclub that's got a little bit of reverberation. In a studio, depending on how something's recorded, you can sometimes actually hear like the sound of the bass bouncing off of the back wall. It's a very interesting thing to listen for. And it's very real, you know. You would hear if the drummer dropped a stick or something like that, or if he accidentally hit the drum shell instead of hitting the snare drum kind of thing, or intentionally. It's a whole different concept than, I guess, electronic music. And it's very real. I mean, you can hear the guy's fingers sliding sometimes on an upright bass or an acoustic guitar or something. And I like that warmth and that almost physical feeling, like the guys were there playing in the room with you. And I'm not going to show. I got like 50 Miles Davis vinyls here, but one of the ones I got into is this particular one, Quiet Nights with Gil Evans, which I can't believe I didn't buy this on CD. I've got like 100 or more Miles Davis CDs, and I didn't buy this one yet. Now this is an orchestral album, and everybody gives a big thumbs down. It's funny with me. It seems like I like the stuff from Miles Davis, and to me the most listened to Miles Davis albums are the ones that people kind of put off in the it's okay, but it's not that good, and it's certainly not a classic category. Well, Miles recorded a lot, but for me, a whole bunch of the albums that fall into the this is what you buy when you've bought 99% of Miles' stuff, and you buy this and it's okay, but it's not great. I love Quiet Nights. Now, this was the last collaboration with Gil Evans. So Gil Evans was a jazz arranger who would write. Sometimes he would compose original tracks. Most of the time, what he did is take an existing piece of music and create an entirely different and new arrangement of that music for a whole orchestra. Strings, horns, everything. And he did 3 classic albums with Miles Davis, including one called Sketches of Spain, which is considered a classic, which I love very much. And for what was to be their last collaboration, the 4th and last collaboration, the record company, this was in the early 60s, I think about 1962, record company wanted him to do a bossa nova, because all of a sudden bossa nova got really hot album. And Gil Evans started working on it and finding material and writing the arrangements, because it's all very time consuming, and recorded about 20 minutes worth of music. And the record company was in such a rush, they're like, we can't wait for the rest of the album, we're just going to put this out as it is. And so they couldn't put out a 20-minute album, so what they did is they found they had a track from a completely different, from the same time period, but a completely different band that Gil Evans had nothing to do with, and there's no orchestra. Miles was also recording in a quartet, which is piano, bass, and drums, and Miles on trumpet, and no saxophone player. And Miles was doing a bunch of sessions for an album that later became 7 Steps of Heaven, and he recorded a bunch of material for that album, and not all of the tracks were used. So Columbia Records, wanting to put out this new album but only having 20 minutes worth of material, took one of these quartet songs, that had nothing to do with the Gil Evans and the orchestral stuff. And they tacked it onto the album just to get another like 7 or 8 minutes playing time. So you got an album here that runs 26 or 27 minutes. Very short. But damn it, I love it. And the fact is, the quartet track that they added on, that's just a quartet, there's no orchestra, Gil Evans doesn't have anything to do with it, it's just Miles and his bass, piano, and drummer during these sessions. They chose a ballad, which was a really good fit, I think, with the orchestra stuff. Because obviously the orchestra stuff is perceived as a lot more mellow and laid back. Had they put on an up-tempo bebop track, by Miles with his quartet, I don't know if that would have worked. But they chose a ballad called For Summer Night. And I love it. It's a nice... Now, there's a whole album from the same sessions that track came from. And that's the only track on here with this quartet configuration. But that jazz quartet track amongst the orchestral stuff just really works for me. I absolutely love it. Absolutely love it. But I haven't bought this on CD yet. And I was listening to it online because the whole thing's up on YouTube. So I wasn't playing my vinyl either. And I was going to go on to talk even more, just as typical. I don't do, how long has it been? 2-3 months since I did a video? And because I don't know what to talk about, but then once I get my yap going, forget it. And I got a whole bunch of stuff back there in the bed I'm not going to show. Maybe for next time. So I'm going to talk more about my new album, my next video. Hopefully it'll be out there. I hope it's out there by that time. I know CD Baby is getting their copies on Monday, but I don't know how long it takes them to distribute. It usually takes them a few weeks to do distribution. So, any questions you guys have, if there's something you ever want me to address in a video, just put a comment in. Especially based on the stuff I've already spoken about. And I'd be happy to at least consider it and see if I can come up with anything in that area that you're asking about. Okay, guys. I feel good that I did this video, even though it's probably crap. Just to get out there, to be able to say hello to all the regulars whose videos I watch, and the friends I have and the people that I like to keep in contact with. And I feel bad for being away, and it's like I dropped off the face of the earth. So, this is more than anything else, it's hey, I'm still out here, and I'm hoping to pick it up again. Actually, the weather's getting warmer, and I may or may not go back out to the garage. This year, I actually brought the computer into the inside of the house here that I had out in the garage because I was very concerned about how cold it gets out there, because it can get down to, 10 or 15 or 5 degrees out there during the more extreme winter days. And that computer out there is old, and it's already dying, if you remember the problems I've had with recording videos on it. So I didn't want to make it suffer through another winter, so I brought it inside. But, we're finally hitting days where it's 50 degrees or so out there. And it's quite cool in the garage, but actually it's warmer now than it was when I recorded my last videos out there toward the end of last year, toward the end of 2018. I was recording videos out there when I was absolutely freezing. So I just have to get the computer back out there, and I got to hook it up again. And I don't know if it's going to work. And if it doesn't work, because it's got this funny thing is I record a video, and when I'm done recording it, it just erases the video. I might end up being permanently in here. I'm not sure. But I'm going to try to get back out to the garage. So thanks for watching. Sorry for going on so long, and I'll try to maybe come back with more regularity with shorter videos if I possibly can. Okay? Nice seeing everybody again. Hope everybody's doing well.